You ever start your morning thinking it'll be just another peaceful day on the farm, only to find out someone's taken a bulldozer to your property? No? Just me? Well, grab your coffee and settle in, because I'm about to tell you how my quiet country road turned into a battleground with the most entitled Karen I've ever met, a woman who decided my private farm road was her personal highway to success. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Jack, proud owner of Silver Creek Farm, a beautiful stretch of land that's been feeding this county for 4 generations. Most days, I wake up before dawn, check on my livestock, and thank my lucky stars that my great-grandfather had the foresight to build this place far enough from town to keep the peace. Or at least, that's how it used to be. That particular morning started like any other. The roosters were doing their thing, the morning dew was fresh on the grass, and my ancient coffee maker was churning out what my daughter likes to call Dad's morning motivation juice. I was standing on my front porch, enjoying that first sip of coffee and watching the sun peek over the eastern fields, when I heard it. The unmistakable rumble of heavy machinery. Now, if you've lived on a farm long enough, you know every sound has a meaning. The different ways your tractor coughs when it needs attention, the specific creak of a gate that needs oiling, even the varied moos of your cattle telling you it's feeding time. But this sound didn't belong. It was like hearing a motorcycle at a meditation retreat, completely and utterly wrong. I nearly dropped my favorite coffee mug, the one my kids got me that says, "Best Dad in the Barn," when I saw what was happening down at my private road. You know, the gravel road my grandfather laid down 60 years ago? The one that winds through the back of our property and connects to the main highway? Yeah, that one. There was a full-sized bulldozer, painted the most offensive shade of yellow I'd ever seen, literally tearing up my road like it was playing in a sandbox. And there she was, standing next to it in designer boots that had clearly never seen a day of real work, clutching a tablet like it was some sort of royal scepter. Her platinum blonde hair was styled to within an inch of its life, and she was wearing what looked like a real estate agent's power suit in the middle of farm country. Let me tell you, seeing someone dressed for a corporate boardroom standing in the middle of your farm at 6 a.m. is about as natural as finding a penguin in the desert. I must have made some sort of noise, probably something between a gasp and a growl, because she turned around and had the audacity to wave at me. Not a sheepish, "oops, I got caught" wave, mind you. No, this was a beauty pageant wave, complete with a $1 million smile that probably cost exactly that much. "Good morning," she called out, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Hope we didn't wake you. We're just making some necessary improvements to connect the new development to the main road. You'll thank me later. Thank her for destroying my private road, the road that's been in my family longer than she's probably been alive." The coffee in my stomach turned to acid as I watched another chunk of my property get torn up by that monster machine. This wasn't just about a road. This was about someone thinking they could waltz onto private property and do whatever they pleased. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. That morning would kick off a battle that would test everything I believed about property rights, common sense, and just how far some people will go to get their way. But let me tell you something. They picked the wrong farmer to mess with. You see, my grandpa always said, the only thing worth more than the land itself is the principle of protecting it. And as I stood there, watching this woman treat my property like her personal construction site, I knew exactly what he meant. This wasn't just about a road anymore, this was war. And folks, you're about to hear how a simple farmer taught a lesson to someone who thought money and connections could bulldoze right over other people's rights. Trust me, you're going to want to hear how this one ends. Let me give you some context about Silver Creek Farm and how we ended up in this mess. This land isn't just dirt and crops to me, it's living history, shaped by 4 generations of my family's sweat and determination. My great-grandfather, Thomas Miller, bought these 200 acres back in 1923, with money he'd saved working 3 jobs. He had a dream of building something that would last, something his children's children could be proud of. That private road she was so casually destroying? That was laid down by my grandfather in 1962, every inch of gravel meticulously placed to ensure it would stand the test of time. He spent an entire summer getting it just right, creating the perfect gradient for water runoff and making sure the foundation was solid enough to handle farm equipment. I still remember him telling me stories about it when I was a kid, sitting on his lap in the old rocking chair that's still on my porch today. Over the years, we've watched the world change around us. The Thompson family's dairy farm to the east was parceled off into a subdivision about 15 years ago. The old Miller orchard, no relation, to the west became a strip mall. One by one, the farming families I grew up with sold their land to developers who saw dollar signs where we saw heritage. But Silver Creek Farm, we stayed put. It wasn't for lack of offers, mind you. Every real estate developer within 100 miles has tried to get their hands on our land. They'd show up in their shiny cars with their glossy presentations, talking about prime location and untapped potential. The last one, about 6 months ago, even tried to convince me that selling was my civic duty to help the growing community. I showed him the door faster than my border collie chases sheep. You see, this farm isn't just about making money, though we do all right, supplying organic produce to local markets and running one of the last successful dairy operations in the county. It's about maintaining something real in a world that seems to be getting more artificial by the day. We've adapted, sure, added solar panels to the barn roof, set up an online ordering system for our farm store, even started hosting educational tours for local schools. But the soul of the place, that hasn't changed. The road that's currently being destroyed was actually a big part of what made our adaptation possible. That private access to the highway meant we could get our products to market efficiently without having to navigate through suburban traffic. It gave delivery trucks a straight shot to our loading dock, and during harvest season, it was our lifeline for getting crops out quickly. I've maintained that road meticulously over the years, just like my grandfather taught me. Every spring, I'd check for winter damage and lay new gravel where needed. After heavy rains, I'd be out there making sure the drainage ditches were clear. That road wasn't just a way to get from point A to point B, it was part of our farm's infrastructure, as important as the irrigation system or the barn itself. The community around us has changed dramatically, especially in the last 5 years. Where there used to be fields stretching to the horizon, now there are rows of cookie-cutter houses with postage stamp yards. The Meadowbrook Estates development went up last year, followed by Sunset Ridge and Farmview Heights, though I can tell you there's not a farm in view anymore, unless you count our place. I tried to be a good neighbor through all the changes. When the new residents would accidentally turn down our road looking for their subdivisions, I put up better signage. When kids from the developments would cut through our fields, I built proper fencing rather than making a fuss. I even started a small pumpkin patch and hayride in the fall so the suburban families could get a taste of farm life. But there's being neighborly, and then there's being a doormat. I've watched other farmers get pushed around by developers and city planners who see agricultural land as nothing but future housing developments waiting to happen. I've seen private roads turned into public thoroughfares, drainage patterns altered by new construction that flooded generations-old fields, and farmers blamed for the noise and smell of agriculture by people who moved in next door to a working farm. So when I saw that bulldozer tearing up our road, I knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't just about convenience for a new development. This was another attempt to chip away at what's left of our agricultural heritage, another step in pushing out the farms that had fed this community for generations. But unlike some of my neighbors who'd given in to the pressure, I had no intention of letting our piece of history be paved over for someone else's profit. The irony of it all? That road they were destroying was built to last, built with the kind of care and craftsmanship you rarely see anymore. My grandfather used to say, "Do it right or don't do it at all." Looking at that bulldozer, I couldn't help but think how far we've come from those values. Just a week before the bulldozer incident, everything at Silver Creek Farm was running like a well-oiled machine. I'd spent the early fall getting ready for the harvest season, making sure all our equipment was in top condition and our storage facilities were prepared. The weather had been kind to us that year, just enough rain to keep the crops happy, but not so much that it interfered with the work. I'd been particularly proud of our latest addition to the farm, a state-of-the-art dairy processing facility that would let us bottle our own milk and make artisanal cheese right on site. It was a big investment, but one that would help keep the farm viable for the next generation. My daughter Sarah, who's studying agricultural science in college, had helped design the layout during her summer break. The facility was set to open in just a month, and we'd already secured contracts with several local grocery stores. The private road was crucial to this new venture. We'd carefully planned delivery routes and even had the county inspector out to verify that the road could handle the increased traffic from our refrigerated trucks. He'd given us a glowing report, commenting on how well-maintained the road was, compared to some of the public roads in the area. "They don't build them like this anymore," he'd said, running his hand over the carefully graded gravel. If he could see it now. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The week before, everything went sideways. I had to head up to Burlington for the Regional Agricultural Conference. It was a 3-day event where farmers from across the state gathered to discuss new farming techniques, compare notes on sustainable practices, and generally support each other in keeping our agricultural heritage alive. I'd been invited to give a talk about our new dairy facility and how small farms could adapt to changing markets while maintaining their independence. Before leaving, I'd done my usual security rounds, checked all the gates, made sure the security cameras were working, a sad necessity these days with all the development around us, and left detailed instructions for my farm manager, Mike. He's been with us for 15 years and knows the place almost as well as I do. I'd even joked with him about keeping an eye out for any more real estate developers sniffing around. "Don't worry, boss," he'd said, leaning against the barn door. "Nobody's getting past me with any crazy development schemes while you're gone." If only he'd known what was coming. The conference itself was actually pretty inspiring. I met other farmers who were facing similar pressures from urban sprawl, and we shared strategies for protecting our land rights. There was a particularly interesting session about agricultural easements and legal protections for historical farmland. I took detailed notes, never imagining how relevant they'd become just a few days later. I remember calling home each evening to check in. Everything was running smoothly. Mike reported that the new calves were doing well, the fall crops were right on schedule, and there hadn't been any unusual activity around the property. The most exciting news was that our new cheese-making equipment had arrived ahead of schedule and was safely stored in the new facility. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The last night of the conference, I stayed up late talking with a farmer from the western part of the state who'd successfully fought off a developer's attempt to claim part of his land through eminent domain. We discussed the importance of keeping detailed records and maintaining good relationships with local officials. "Document everything," he'd advised, tapping his finger on the table for emphasis. "You never know when you might need to prove your rights." I drove back Sunday night, taking the scenic route home. The autumn colors were at their peak, and the setting sun painted the farmland in shades of gold and amber. I remember feeling optimistic about the future of Silver Creek Farm. We were adapting to changing times while staying true to our roots. The new dairy facility would secure our place in the local food economy, and our private road would ensure we could get our products to market efficiently. Pulling into the farm after dark, everything looked peaceful. The security lights cast their usual soft glow over the buildings, and I could hear the distant lowing of cattle in the night air. I did a quick check of the property before heading to bed, more out of habit than concern. The road was exactly as it should be, solid, well-maintained, and decidedly unpaved. If I'd known what was coming, I might have stayed up all night standing guard. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. I went to bed thinking about delivery schedules and cheese production, not property rights and bulldozers. As I drifted off to sleep, the biggest concern on my mind was whether we'd ordered enough bottles for the first milk run. It's funny how life can change overnight. One moment you're planning for the future, feeling secure in your piece of the world, and the next, well, you know what happened next. But I couldn't have known that while I was sleeping, someone was already setting in motion events that would turn our quiet farm into ground zero for a battle over property rights and personal entitlement. That Monday morning started like any other at Silver Creek Farm. The alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., same as it had for the past 25 years. I went through my usual routine, pulled on my work boots, started the coffee maker that's probably older than most of my new neighbors, and headed to the front porch to plan out the day while the coffee brewed. The autumn air was crisp, carrying that distinct scent of fallen leaves and morning dew that every farmer knows by heart. Our farm dog, Max, was unusually agitated, pacing back and forth on the porch instead of settling into his usual spot by my feet. I should have taken that as the first sign something was wrong. Animals always know before we do. I grabbed my coffee mug, the one Sarah gave me for Father's Day with cartoon cows dancing around the rim, and poured myself a cup. The steam rose in delicate swirls against the pre-dawn darkness, and for just a moment, everything felt perfectly normal. That's when I heard it. A low, mechanical rumble that seemed completely out of place in our peaceful morning symphony. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a truck on the highway, though it sounded closer than that. Could be one of the neighboring developments starting construction early, though they usually didn't begin work until after sunrise. But Max's continued agitation and that persistent rumble finally got the better of my curiosity. I stepped off the porch, coffee still in hand, and headed toward our private road. The sky was just beginning to lighten, that grey-blue time before sunrise, when everything looks a little surreal. As I rounded the corner past our new dairy facility, the source of that rumble became horrifyingly clear. There was a massive yellow bulldozer, its engine idling like some mechanical beast, sitting right in the middle of what used to be our carefully maintained gravel road. Behind it stretched a path of destruction that made my heart stop. Our historic private road had been completely torn up, the gravel pushed aside like worthless dirt. The careful drainage system my grandfather had engineered completely destroyed. But that wasn't even the worst part. Following the trail of devastation, I could see where they'd already started laying down a base for asphalt. Black tar paper-lined sections of the torn-up road and stacks of construction materials sat off to the side like they belonged there. Like this was all perfectly normal and planned. The coffee in my stomach turned to acid as I took in the full scope of the damage. This wasn't just some minor vandalism or misunderstanding. This was a calculated operation. Someone had brought in heavy equipment, construction materials, and workers, all while I was asleep. The sheer audacity of it made my hands shake with anger. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, a sleek SUV pulled up, its tires crunching over what remained of our gravel road. Out stepped a woman I'd later come to know as Karen Davidson, though at that moment she was just the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong with our once rural community. The rising sun caught the enormous diamond on her finger as she waved dismissively at my shocked expression. She was dressed like she was heading to a corporate board meeting rather than a construction site, her designer heels sinking slightly into the soft earth as she picked her way toward me. "Oh, good, you're up," she called out, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "I was hoping to catch you early. We're making some improvements to this old road, bringing it up to modern standards, you know. It'll be so much better for everyone once it's properly paved." I looked from her perfectly manicured appearance to the destruction behind her, then back again. The contrast was almost comical. This woman, who probably had never worked a day of manual labor in her life, standing there acting like she was doing me a favor by destroying a piece of my family's heritage. The sun was fully up now, illuminating the full extent of what they'd done. Not only had they torn up the road, but they'd also removed sections of our fence line, damaged the drainage ditches that prevented flooding in our lower fields, and created a mess that would take months to fix, if it could be fixed at all. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about paving a road. This was about someone deciding they had the right to take what wasn't theirs, to destroy something they didn't understand, all in the name of improvement. The coffee mug in my hand suddenly felt too fragile for the rage building inside me. I set it down carefully on a fence post, knowing that what was about to happen would require my full attention. This was the moment everything changed. The moment when running a peaceful dairy farm became a battle for property rights. The moment when live and let live turned into stand your ground. And as I stood there, watching more construction vehicles roll up like an invading army, I knew this was going to be the fight of my life. The surge of emotions that hit me in that moment was unlike anything I'd experienced in my decades of farming. You face all sorts of challenges in agriculture: droughts, floods, equipment failures, market crashes, but nothing prepares you for watching someone deliberately destroy your property while smiling about it. My hands were shaking, not from the morning chill or the caffeine, but from pure, unadulterated anger. I could feel my face getting hot, and the vein in my temple, the one Sarah says appears when I'm about to lose my temper, was probably visible from space. But years of dealing with unpredictable livestock and temperamental weather had taught me one valuable lesson. Acting on raw emotion rarely leads to good decisions. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself the way my father had taught me. "When you're dealing with a startled bull," he used to say, "the worst thing you can do is let it see you're afraid or angry." Well, I wasn't dealing with a bull, but the principle seemed just as applicable to entitled developers who thought they could bulldoze their way through life. Looking more closely at the destruction, I started mentally cataloging every detail. The original drainage culverts, installed by my grandfather and maintained religiously for 60 years, had been completely ripped out. The carefully graded gravel surface, which we'd just refreshed last spring at considerable expense, was pushed into messy piles along what used to be the shoulder of the road. They'd even taken down sections of our fence, the heavy-duty agricultural fencing that kept our dairy herd safely contained. The more I looked, the more damage I discovered. The construction crew had carelessly piled dirt against several of our mature maple trees, trees that had provided shade along that road since before I was born. Their root systems were now compromised, and any arborist worth their salt would tell you those trees might not survive the trauma. "Isn't it exciting?" Karen's voice cut through my inventory of destruction like a nail on a chalkboard. She was tapping away on her tablet, probably already planning the next phase of her improvement project. "We're thinking of adding streetlights, too. This dark country road thing is so primitive." That word, primitive, hit me like a physical blow. 4 generations of careful land management, sustainable farming practices, and responsible stewardship reduced to primitive by someone who probably couldn't tell alfalfa from crabgrass. I watched as she stepped daintily around a pile of mud, her designer shoes already showing signs of distress from their encounter with actual earth. Mike, my farm manager, came jogging up at that moment, obviously having heard the commotion. His face went from confusion to shock to anger in the span of about 3 seconds. He'd helped me maintain this road for 15 years, and I could see him doing the same mental calculations I had about the extent of the damage. "Boss," he said quietly, "coming to stand beside me, the dairy trucks are due in 2 hours. They can't get through this mess." His words brought another wave of reality crashing down. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. This was actively threatening our livelihood, the new dairy facility, our contracts with local stores. Our entire operation depended on that road being passable. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, documenting every bit of damage I could see. The displaced gravel, the torn-up culverts, the damaged trees, the removed fencing, everything. Mike caught on immediately and started doing the same from different angles. Karen watched us with an expression of mild amusement, like we were children playing at being grown-ups. "Oh, don't worry about documentation," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Our contractors are fully insured, and all the proper paperwork has been filed. This is completely by the book." She paused, then added with what she probably thought was generosity. "We'll even let you use the new paved road for your farm things, free of charge." The sheer audacity of her offering me permission to use my own road nearly broke my carefully maintained composure. I felt my jaw clenching so hard it hurt. Mike must have sensed I was about to lose it, because he stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between me and Karen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but cold, "I believe you'll find that this is private property. You don't have the authority to offer anyone permission to use it." She laughed. Actually laughed, like we'd just told a mildly amusing joke at a cocktail party. "Oh, that's adorable. But you see, this road has been designated as a necessary access route for the new Valley Vista development. The community needs this improvement, and frankly," she looked around with barely concealed disdain, "it's about time this area joined the 21st century. I found my voice then, and it came out surprisingly calm, though anyone who knew me would have recognized the danger in that calmness. "Get your equipment off my property," I said quietly. "Now." She blinked, apparently not used to direct opposition. "I don't think you understand." "No," I interrupted. "I understand perfectly. What you need to understand is that in about 2 hours, I'm expecting dairy trucks that need to use this road. If they can't get through, you'll be personally responsible for any losses we incur. And trust me, those losses will be substantial." Having thoroughly documented the damage with photos and videos, I knew the next step had to be confronting whoever was officially behind this mess. Karen had mentioned something about proper paperwork, and I was determined to find out exactly what she meant by that. After making emergency arrangements with our dairy trucks to use a temporary access route through our back fields, not ideal, but necessary, I headed into town. The county planning office was housed in one of those modern glass buildings that always seem to be trying too hard to look important. Walking through the automatic doors, I felt immediately out of place. My work boots left small clumps of dirt on the polished floor, and my jacket still had hay clinging to it from the morning's chores. The receptionist looked up at me like I was some sort of agricultural apparition that had wandered in from another century. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested she'd rather be doing anything else. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge of road development permits," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "specifically about unauthorized construction on private property." She clicked through something on her computer, the sound of her acrylic nails on the keyboard somehow making the whole situation more irritating. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, I don't have an appointment," I replied, feeling my patience starting to wear thin. What I have is a bulldozer tearing up my private road without my permission, and I need to speak with someone about it. Now!" The urgency in my voice must have finally registered, because she picked up her phone and made a call. After a brief conversation filled with meaningful glances in my direction, she pointed me toward an elevator. "Fourth floor, suite 412, Mr. Richardson will see you." The elevator ride gave me time to collect my thoughts. I had my phone ready with the photos and videos, property deeds downloaded on my tablet. Thank you, Sarah, for insisting I digitize all our important documents, and a determination to get answers. Suite 412 turned out to be a corner office with a view of what used to be farmland, but was now a sea of retail developments. Fitting, really. Behind a desk that probably cost more than my first tractor sat Bradley Richardson, Development Planning Director, according to the nameplate on his desk. "Mr. Miller," he greeted me, not bothering to stand. "I understand you have some concerns about the Valley Vista Access Road project?" I pulled out my tablet and laid it on his desk, displaying a photo of the destruction. "Concerns? That's putting it mildly. Someone is destroying my private road without permission, claiming they have proper paperwork. I want to see it." Richardson leaned back in his chair, adopting that bureaucratic pose I've come to recognize, the one that says, "I'm about to explain why you're wrong about something you've known all your life." "Ah, yes, the Davidson Development Group submitted their plans months ago. The road in question has been designated as a necessary thoroughfare for the new development." "Designated by whom?" I demanded. "Because I own that road, Mr. Richardson. It's private property that's been in my family for generations, and nobody consulted me about any designation." He shuffled through some papers on his desk, pulling out a file with surprising efficiency. "According to our records, notices were sent out to all affected property owners in June. The public comment period ended in August." "I never received any notice," I said firmly. "And even if I had, you can't just take private property by sending a letter. There are laws about this." Richardson's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something, concern maybe, crossing his face. He opened the file and frowned. "That's odd. Our records show the notices were sent, but I'm not seeing any return receipt or acknowledgement. From your address." "Because I never received it," I repeated, "and I can prove that road is private property. I have surveys, deeds, and 60 years of tax records showing we've maintained it at our own expense." I pulled up the documents on my tablet, spreading them out digitally like a poker player laying down a winning hand. Richardson's frown deepened as he scrolled through them. "This is irregular," he admitted finally. "The Davidson Group's application indicated this was an abandoned public access road that had fallen into private use. Their environmental impact study and development plans were all based on that assumption." "Well, their assumption was wrong," I said flatly, "and now they've caused thousands of dollars in damage to my property and are threatening my farm's operations. So what are you going to do about it?" Richardson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Miller, you have to understand, this is a complex situation. The development plans have already been approved. Contracts have been signed." "Complex?" I interrupted. "Let me simplify it for you. Either show me the legal documentation giving them the right to destroy my property, or I'm filing for an immediate injunction to stop all construction. And trust me, the local news would love to hear about how the county is allowing developers to bulldoze private property without permission." That got his attention. The mention of media attention tends to make bureaucrats nervous, and Richardson was no exception. He quickly pulled out a legal pad and started taking notes. "Let me look into this," he said, his tone notably more professional. "I'll need to consult with our legal department and review the original application materials. In the meantime, I'll issue a temporary stop work order for the road construction." It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was a start. As I stood to leave, I decided to drive the point home. One more thing, Mr. Richardson. Those developers damaged my drainage system and removed agricultural fencing. If any of my livestock get out because of their actions, that's going to be another whole level of liability. I suggest you make that stop work order your top priority. After leaving the county office, I decided to do some digging into who exactly Karen Davidson was, and what gave her the idea she could steamroll over a family farm. It didn't take long to find out. Apparently, she wasn't shy about making herself known. A quick search on my phone pulled up more information than I'd expected, and none of it made me feel better about the situation. Karen Davidson, CEO of Davidson Development Group, had made quite a name for herself in the real estate world. Local business magazines painted her as a visionary developer and transformative force in rural development. But reading between the lines, I saw something else, a pattern of aggressive expansion and questionable tactics that had changed the face of 3 other farming communities in the past 5 years. I was sitting in my truck, scrolling through articles, when Mike called. "Boss, you need to get back here. She's back and she brought reinforcements." When I pulled up to the farm, I found Karen holding what looked like an impromptu meeting right on my property. She'd set up a folding table complete with architectural drawings and was surrounded by a group of people in business attire who looked about as comfortable on a farm as a pig at a tea party. "Mr. Miller," she called out as I approached, that artificial smile still plastered on her face. Perfect timing. I was just explaining to my associates how our Valley Vista Access Initiative will benefit the entire community, including your quaint operation. The way she said quaint made it sound like she was describing something she'd scraped off her shoe. I noticed she'd changed into what she probably thought was appropriate farm wear. Designer boots that had clearly never seen mud and what looked like a $500 plaid shirt. "The only thing you're explaining," I said firmly, "is why you're trespassing on my property. Again." She laughed, that practiced, condescending laugh that probably worked wonders at cocktail parties. "Oh, Mr. Miller, I can see we got off on the wrong foot this morning. Let me properly introduce myself. Karen Davidson, CEO of Davidson Development Group." She extended her hand, multiple gold bracelets jingling. "We specialize in transforming underutilized rural spaces into thriving modern communities." I didn't take her hand. "You mean you specialize in destroying farmland?" Her smile tightened just a fraction. "We prefer to think of it as progress, evolution, the natural order of things." She gestured to her drawings. "Just look at what we're proposing. A modern access road properly paved and lit, connecting Valley Vista to the main highway. Property values in the area will skyrocket." "This isn't about property values," I countered. "This is about private property rights and the fact that you're destroying a working farm's infrastructure." One of her associates, a young man in an expensive suit, stepped forward with a tablet. "Ms. Davidson has an impressive track record of similar projects. The Meadowbrook transformation increased local property values by 300%. Meadowbrook? I remembered that name. "You mean the Johnson family dairy farm? The one that went bankrupt after their access road was mysteriously rezoned?" Karen's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes. "The Johnsons were adequately compensated for any inconvenience. They simply failed to adapt to changing times." That's when it clicked. The Johnsons hadn't failed. They'd been systematically pushed out, cut off from their traditional access routes, forced to take longer routes to market until maintaining their operation became impossible. And now Karen was trying to pull the same trick here. "Let me be very clear," I said, stepping closer to her table. "I've seen your playbook. Claim abandoned roads, rezone farm access routes, create problems for working farms until they have no choice but to sell. Well, it won't work here." For just a moment her mask slipped, the practiced smile vanished, replaced by something harder, colder. "Mr. Miller, I don't think you understand how this works. Progress is inevitable. You can either Profit from it or be run over by it. The choice is yours. No, Karen, I replied, emphasizing her first name, watching her bristle at the familiarity. I don't think you understand. This isn't some corporate takeover where you can bulldoze your way to success. This is my land, my road, and my livelihood. And I've already spoken with the county office. They're issuing a stop work order. Her composure cracked just slightly. A temporary setback. I have connections, Mr. Miller. People who understand the importance of development. One phone call and that stop work order disappears. Is that a threat? That's business, she replied, her voice sharp. Something you clearly don't understand. This road is happening one way or another. The only question is how difficult you want to make it for yourself. As if on cue, her phone rang. She glanced at it, smiled that predatory smile again, and answered. Bradley, yes, I was just about to call you. She walked a few steps away, but her voice carried clearly. What do you mean, complications? I thought we had an understanding. Watching her pace and gesture, I realized what I was dealing with. Sharon Davidson wasn't just some developer. She was the personification of everything that had been slowly killing family farms for decades. The difference was, she didn't hide behind corporate speak and legal jargon. She wore her entitlement and disdain openly, like her designer clothes and expensive jewelry. Well, if she wanted a fight, she'd get one. And something told me she wasn't used to opponents who couldn't be bought off or bullied into submission. Karen's phone call with Bradley Richardson ended abruptly, and when she turned back to face me, her perfectly composed facade had cracked. Noticeably, the carefully maintained smile was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that would have curdled milk. There seems to be some confusion at the county office, she said, her voice clipped. Nothing that can't be resolved with the right conversations with the right people. She turned to her associates. Pack up the presentation. We need to handle this differently. As her entourage began gathering their materials, I noticed one of them quietly slip her a document. She scanned it quickly, and suddenly that predatory smile returned. Actually, Mr. Miller, while the county sorts out their paperwork, there's something you should know. Your road isn't just blocking progress, it's creating a public safety hazard. A safety hazard? I couldn't help but laugh. That road's been here for 60 years without a single accident. She held up the document triumphantly. According to our environmental impact study, your private road is impeding emergency service access to the Valley Vista development. Response times could be delayed by up to 7 minutes. Surely you wouldn't want to be responsible for putting lives at risk? That's rich, coming from someone who just destroyed a perfectly good road and replaced it with a construction zone, I shot back. And I've read enough of your impact studies to know they're about as reliable as a three-legged stool. She pressed on, her voice taking on a theatrical concern. Not to mention the environmental issues. Our studies show your gravel road is contributing to water runoff problems that could affect the entire watershed. The EPA takes these matters very seriously. Now, that was a step too far. Environmental issues. The drainage system you just destroyed was designed specifically to prevent runoff. It's worked perfectly for decades. Your concrete and asphalt are what's going to cause environmental problems. The studies speak for themselves, she said smugly, waving the document. And once the relevant authorities see them, you mean the studies conducted by Davidson Environmental Services? I interrupted. Funny how a company owned by your brother always finds exactly the problems you need to push through your developments. The same thing happened with the Johnson farm, didn't it? That hit home. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. I'd be very careful about making accusations, Mr. Miller. Defamation is a serious matter. So is fraud, I countered, and trespassing, and destruction of private property. Would you like me to continue? One of her associates, a nervous-looking man in wire-rimmed glasses, whispered something in her ear. She waved him off impatiently. Mr. Miller, let's be reasonable. This road project is going forward whether you like it or not. Fighting it will only cost you time and money you can't afford to waste. Why not work with us instead? We could discuss compensation, perhaps even a partnership opportunity in Valley Vista. You mean like the partnership you offered the Johnsons before you drove them into bankruptcy? Her composure slipped again, just for a moment, but long enough to reveal the steel beneath the silk. The Johnsons were resistant to change, just like you. Look where it got them. Times change, Mr. Miller. The world moves forward. You can either move with it or be left behind. Let me make something clear, I said, stepping closer, close enough to see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. This isn't about change or progress. This is about right and wrong. You thought you could just waltz in here, destroy my property, and bully me into submission with your fancy paperwork and veiled threats. Well, you picked the wrong farmer to mess with. She squared her shoulders, trying to regain control of the situation. This isn't personal, Mr. Miller. It's just business. No, Karen, you made it personal the moment you sent that bulldozer onto my land. And if you think I'm going to roll over and let you destroy what my family has built over 4 generations, you're in for a hell of a fight. She gathered her things, her movements sharp with anger. We'll see about that. I have resources you can't imagine, Mr. Miller. Connections you don't even know exist. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd taken my offer. As she and her entourage retreated to their luxury vehicles, I called after her. You forgot something. Karen! She turned, eyebrow raised. Your environmental impact study? It's missing one crucial detail, the impact of what happens when you mess with a farmer who has nothing left to lose. The slam of her car door was almost as satisfying as watching her expensive tires spin in the mud as they left. But I knew this was just the beginning. Karen Davidson had shown her true colors, and the battle lines were clearly drawn. She had her money, her connections, and her corporate power. But I had something she couldn't buy or bully: the truth, the law, and a lifetime of dealing with stubborn creatures who didn't know when to back down. Game on, Karen, game on. After Karen's departure, I spent the afternoon making calls and doing research, trying to understand exactly what we were up against. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The Davidson Development Group wasn't just another real estate company. It was the tip of a very large, very corrupt iceberg. I was sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by printouts and notes, when Sarah called. My daughter might be away at college studying agricultural science, but she's always been the tech-savvy one in the family. Dad, you're not going to believe what I found about Karen Davidson, she said without preamble. Try me, I replied, adding another note to my growing pile of information. I've been doing some digging myself. She's on the County Planning Commission's advisory board, Sarah said. And guess who else is? Her brother James Davidson, the same one who runs the environmental consulting firm that does all their impact studies. But here's the real kicker. Their cousin Thomas sits on the zoning board. It was starting to make sense now, the confident way Karen had dismissed the stop work order, her certainty that she could make problems disappear. The Davidsons hadn't just built a development company. They'd created a web of influence that touched every aspect of local governance. There's more, Sarah continued. I found records of 3 other farms in neighboring counties. All of them had similar stories: mysterious rezoning, sudden road access issues, environmental citations that appeared out of nowhere, and all of them ended up selling to Davidson Development Group for pennies on the dollar. Mike chose that moment to walk in, carrying a stack of papers. Boss, you need to see this, he said, spreading them out on the table. They were photographs, aerial views of the surrounding area taken over the past 5 years. I got these from old Jim at the feed store. He used to do aerial crop surveys. The transformation was stark. What had once been a patchwork of family farms had been systematically carved up into developments, each one bearing the Davidson Development Group logo. Our farm was now like an island in a sea of suburban sprawl. Look at the pattern, Mike pointed out. They start with the access, roads. Then suddenly the farms start having problems getting their products to market. Within a year, they're forced to sell. I was about to respond when my phone buzzed with a text from Tom, my friend at the local bank. Emergency meeting at Davidson Development Group tonight. Board members and major investors only. Something about fast-tracking the Valley Vista project. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was uglier than I'd imagined. Karen Davidson wasn't just some entitled developer. She was part of a systematic operation designed to erase family farms from the landscape, one road closure at a time. Just then, another call came in, this one from Bradley Richardson at the county office. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice tense, "I thought you should know. The stop work order. There's been some pressure from above to reconsider it." "Pressure from the Davidson family?" I asked, already knowing the answer. His silence was confirmation enough. "These are powerful people, Mr. Miller. They have friends in every office that matters. The mayor plays golf with James Davidson every Sunday. Karen has the ear of half the county commissioners, and their family foundation makes generous donations to every political campaign in the district. Are you warning me or threatening me, Bradley?" He sighed heavily. "I'm trying to help you understand what you're up against. They don't lose, Mr. Miller. Ever. The last person who tried to fight them, well, let's just say he's not farming anymore. Anywhere." I thanked him for the information and hung up, my mind racing. The Davidson family hadn't just built a development company. They'd created a perfect machine for consuming family farms. The environmental studies, the zoning changes, the access road issues, it was all part of a carefully orchestrated plan. Sarah was still on the other line. "Dad, what are we going to do?" I looked out my kitchen window at the farm, at the fields my great-grandfather had first ploughed, at the barn my grandfather had built, at the new dairy facility we'd just finished. This land represented 4 generations of hard work, determination, and faith in the future of family farming. "We're going to fight," I said firmly, "but we're going to do it smart." The Davidsons might have money and connections, but they've never gone up against someone who knows their playbook and isn't afraid to use it against them. "They'll try to bury you in paperwork and legal fees," Sarah warned. "Let them try. But first, we need to understand exactly how their operation works. Every system has its weak points. We just need to find them." As if to underscore the point, I heard the rumble of machinery in the distance. Looking out, I saw fresh construction equipment arriving at the road site, despite the stop work order. Karen was sending a message. She didn't play by the rules because she thought she owned the rule book. Well, she was about to learn that some things can't be bought, bullied, or buried under paperwork. The truth has a way of coming out, especially when you've got nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The question wasn't whether we could win. It was whether the Davidsons were ready for the fight they'd started, because this wasn't just about a road anymore. This was about exposing a system that had been destroying family farms for years. And it was time someone took a stand. As the sun began to set, I walked my property to fully assess what we were dealing with. The construction equipment sat idle, but menacing at the edge of my road, like mechanical predators waiting to strike. The damage they'd already done was extensive, but it was what they were planning that worried me most. Taking out my notebook, the same one I've used to track crop rotations and cattle lineages for years, I started making a detailed inventory. The immediate problems were clear. The destroyed drainage system would need to be completely rebuilt before the next heavy rain, or we'd risk flooding in the lower fields. The missing sections of fence left our pastures vulnerable. I'd already had Mike set up temporary barriers, but they wouldn't hold forever. But it was the long-term implications that really got to me. I pulled out the plans Karen had so proudly displayed earlier. which Mike had managed to photograph while they were packing up. The access road wasn't just going to be a simple paved path. They were planning a 4-lane boulevard, complete with streetlights, sidewalks, and what they called community access points, cutting into my property. "Dad," Sarah's voice came, from my phone, which I'd left on speaker in my shirt pocket. "I've been going through their other development projects. You need to see these satellite images I'm sending." I pulled out my tablet and opened her email. The before and after photos told a story that made my stomach turn. Green squares of farmland transformed into grey zones of asphalt and concrete, one project at a time. But it was the pattern Sarah had highlighted that caught my attention. "See it?" she asked. "They always start with the roads. Once those are in, they apply pressure to the surrounding properties. Environmental citations, noise complaints, traffic studies, whatever it takes to make farming impossible." I looked at my dairy facility, the new equipment gleaming in the evening light. We'd invested everything in this upgrade, betting on the future of small-scale, sustainable farming. If Karen succeeded in cutting off our efficient access to the highway, our whole operation would be crippled. Mike joined me, carrying the evening's milk production reports. "We managed to get today's shipments out through the backfield route," he said, "but it added 2 hours to the process. If we have to keep doing this, our delivery contracts will be at risk." I did some quick calculations in my head. The extra and time, fuel costs, and wear on the equipment would add up fast. And that was assuming the weather held. One good rain would turn that temporary route into a mud pit. "There's something else," Mike added, hesitating. "Some of the construction workers were talking during their lunch break. I overheard them saying this road project is just phase 1. They're planning to use it as justification for rezoning the entire area." That's when it really hit home. This wasn't just about a road. It was about making our entire operation untenable. They were trying to create a situation where selling would become our only option. Walking over to the damaged section of road, I knelt down and picked up a handful of the displaced gravel. This wasn't just crushed stone. It was part of our farm's history. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. "A good road is like a good fence. Take care of it, and it'll take care of you." The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was the kind of sunset that usually brought me peace, reminding me why I'd chosen to continue the family farming tradition. But tonight, it felt like a warning, the end of an era if we didn't find a way to stop Karen and her development machine. Sarah was still on the phone, her voice determined. "Dad, we need to document everything, every bit of damage, every conversation, every piece of paper they've filed. If they're going to play dirty, we need to be ready." She was right, of course. My daughter had inherited her mother's sharp mind and my father's stubborn determination. Looking at the construction equipment, I made a decision. "Mike," I called out, "get the drone." We'd bought it last year for crop monitoring, but now it would serve a different purpose. We're going to create our own documentation, every inch of damage, every piece of equipment they've brought in, every marker they've laid down. I want it all recorded. As Mike went to get the drone, I continued my inventory. The displaced topsoil would need to be tested for contamination. Knowing the Davidsons, they'd try to blame any environmental issues on us. The damaged trees would need an arborist's assessment. Even the tire tracks from their equipment needed to be photographed and measured. Standing there in the gathering dusk, I realized something important. Karen Davidson might have money, connections, and a well-oiled machine for destroying family farms, but we had something she didn't. Generations of knowledge about this land, a deep understanding of what was at stake, and most importantly, the truth on our side. The question was, would that be enough? Looking at the chaos they'd created in just one day, I knew we were in for the fight of our lives. But as my father always said, the hardest fights are the ones most worth fighting. And this fight wasn't just about our farm. It was about standing. up to a system that had been destroying family farms for far too long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight we had work to do. The Davidson development machine might be powerful, but they were about to learn that some things can't be bulldozed, like the truth and the determination of a farmer protecting his legacy. Back in my farm office, surrounded by documentation and 3 cups of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, I started laying out our battle plan. The old desk, weathered by years of farm paperwork and planning sessions, was now covered with legal documents, satellite images, and Sarah's research on the Davidson Development Group's previous victories. "All right," I said to Mike and Sarah, who was still on video call from college. "We need to think this through strategically. They've got money and connections, but we've got something they don't expect: knowledge of their playbook." I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and started writing. Years of planning crop rotations and herd management had taught me that the best strategies are always laid out clearly and methodically. "First," I began, "we need immediate protection. Sarah, can you send over those property boundary documents you found? We'll need to establish clear markers showing where our land ends and begins. Mike, tomorrow morning, I want you to set up security cameras covering every inch of that road." "Already ordered them," Mike replied, holding up a receipt. "High-definition night vision, motion activated. Should be here first thing tomorrow." "Perfect. Next, we need to protect our operations. That temporary route through the backfields won't work for long." I spread out a topographical map of the farm. "We need to identify all possible alternative access routes and reinforce them. If they try to cut off one path, we'll have backups ready." Sarah's voice crackled through the laptop speaker. "Dad, I've been looking into precedent cases. There's something called a prescriptive easement that might help us. If we can prove continuous use of that road for over 20 years. "We can prove 60, I interrupted, pulling out a thick folder of maintenance records. My father's meticulous. Record-keeping might have seemed obsessive when I was growing up, but now it was worth its weight in gold. "Here's what we're up against," I continued, taping a large piece of paper to the wall. "The Davidsons have 3 main tactics: environmental, pressure, regulatory manipulation, and economic strangulation. We need to counter each one." I started writing. "Environmental defense, complete soil and water testing before they can make false claims. Document current drainage patterns and water flow. Get independent environmental assessment, photo document. All existing wildlife habitats. 2. Regulatory protection. File for historical farm designation. Submit all road maintenance records to county. Request agricultural protection zoning. Document all existing easements and rights-of-way. Economic. Security. Establish alternative delivery routes. Contact all current customers about potential delays. Document all additional costs from their interference. Explore emergency distribution partnerships." "Sarah," I called out, "can you start researching environmental protection laws? Focus on agricultural water rights and historical drainage systems. Mike, tomorrow we need to get soil samples from every section of that road. If they try to claim contamination, we'll have baseline data." Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Tom at the bank. "Meeting just ended. Karen's furious. They're planning something big for tomorrow." "They'll probably try to overwhelm us," Sarah said. "Multiple fronts at once. Construction crews, inspectors, maybe even media." I nodded, adding another section to our plan. "Ooh, documentation strategy. Continuous video surveillance. Daily drone footage. Written logs of all interactions. Photographs with timestamps. Record all conversations. We also need to think about allies," Mike added. "Other farmers in the area, local businesses that depend on us, environmental groups." Good point. I started another list. Support network, local farm bureau, neighboring farmers, long-term customers, environmental organizations. Historical preservation societies, local media contacts. Dad, Sarah interjected, what about social media? The Davidsons always control the narrative in traditional media, but they can't control Facebook and Twitter. People love supporting family farms against big developers. I smiled, my daughter always thinking modern. You handle that part, but keep it professional, facts only, no emotional appeals. We document, we educate, we stand our ground. Looking at our growing battle plan, I felt a surge of determination. The Davidsons might have money and political connections, but we had truth, documentation, and generations of stubborn farmer persistence on our side. One more thing, I added, writing at the bottom of the page. Legal preparation. Document all damages, calculate business losses, prepare injunction paperwork, gather witness statements, review all property deeds, research prescriptive rights. They think we're just simple farmers who'll roll over when faced with their corporate machinery, I said, standing back to look at our strategy wall. But they forgot something important. Farmers don't give up. We can't. It's not in our DNA. Mike nodded, adding his own note to the wall. Remember the Alamo? I couldn't help but laugh. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But if Karen Davidson wants a fight, we'll give her one she'll never forget. We're not just protecting our farm. We're fighting for every family farm they've ever bullied or destroyed. Sarah's voice came through strong and clear. They won't know what hit them. Looking at our battle plan, I felt more confident than I had all day. Karen Davidson might have bulldozers and lawyers, but we had something better. A plan, the truth, and nothing left to lose. Tomorrow would be a new day, and we'd be ready for whatever they threw at us. The fight for Silver Creek Farm was just beginning, and this time the developers weren't going to win. The next morning I was at the office of James Hunter, the best agricultural lawyer in 3 counties, before his secretary had even made the first pot of coffee. His office wasn't fancy, just a small brick building on the edge of town with a tin roof that had seen better days. But what Jim lacked in corporate polish, he made up for in knowledge and determination. Well, Jack, he said, thumbing through the documentation I'd brought. They really stepped in it this time. His reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he examined our photos and records. The wall behind him was lined with law books and framed photos of farms he'd helped save from various threats over the years. The Davidsons aren't known for losing, I reminded him, sipping the strong coffee his secretary had finally brought in. They've got half the county in their pocket. Jim looked up, a glint in his eye that I recognized from my days showing cattle, the look of someone who smelled blood in the water. That's because they've never faced a properly prepared opponent. Most farmers they go after don't have 60 years of documented road maintenance records, or proof of continuous agricultural use, or... He held up the aerial photos Sarah had sent. Evidence of their systematic pattern of targeting family farms. He stood up and walked to his whiteboard, uncapping a marker. Let's break this down legally. First, we've got straight-up trespassing and property damage. That's the easy part. Then we've got interference with business operations. They're actively preventing you from fulfilling contracts with your dairy customers. Can we stop them from continuing the construction? I asked, watching as he filled the whiteboard with legal terms and citations. Better than that, Jim replied, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. We can make them restore everything to its original condition. Every drainage ditch, every foot of gravel, every fence post. And they'll pay for all of it. He turned back to his desk and pulled out a thick file. I've been waiting for someone to take on the Davidsons with a solid case. Look at this. He spread out documents showing similar cases from neighboring counties. They always follow the same pattern, claim abandoned roads, create access issues, then swoop in when the farm starts struggling. But they've gotten sloppy, arrogant. What about their environmental claims? I asked, remembering Karen's threats. Jim actually laughed. You mean the studies done by her brother's company? I'd love to see them try to defend those in court. We'll demand an independent environmental assessment. In fact, he reached for his phone and dialed a number. Martha. Jim Hunter. Remember that conversation we had about developer fraud? I've got something you might be interested in. He listened for a moment, then smiled. How fast can you get a team out to Silver Creek Farm? After he hung up, he explained, Martha Peterson, head of the State Environmental Protection Office. She's been trying to build a case against fraudulent environmental impact studies for years. Your situation might be exactly what she needs. For the next 2 hours, we built our legal strategy. Jim was thorough, methodical, and occasionally downright gleeful as we uncovered more and more holes in the Davidsons' operation. Here's what we're going to do, he said finally, handing me a thick stack of papers. First, we're filing for an emergency injunction, not just against the road construction, but against all Davidson development activities within a mile of your property. Then we're filing a civil suit for damages, trespassing, and interference with business operations. They'll fight back, I warned. Oh, I'm counting on it, Jim replied, that glint returning to his eye. Every response they file, every legal maneuver they make, will just dig them deeper. You've got documentation they don't know exists, evidence they thought they'd buried, and witnesses they never considered. He leaned back in his chair, looking remarkably satisfied. You know what their biggest mistake was? They got lazy. They're so used to bulldozing their way through opposition that they didn't bother checking if you had resources or were willing to fight back. Karen Davidson's used to dealing with farmers who can't afford a long legal battle. But you've got something better than money. You've got evidence. Just then, his phone buzzed. He read the message and smiled. Martha's team will be at your farm this afternoon. I suggest you give them a full tour. Every bit of environmental damage, every disrupted watershed, every affected wildlife area. As I stood to leave, Jim put a hand on my shoulder. One more thing, Jack. This isn't just about your farm anymore. If we can prove a pattern of fraudulent practices, we might be able to help every farmer they've pushed out over the years. Are you ready for that kind of fight? I'd thought about my grandfather, about the generations of farmers who'd worked this land, about all the other families who'd lost their farms to the Davidsons' tactics. Jim, I said, I was born ready. He nodded, already reaching for his phone. Again. Then let's give Karen Davidson a lesson in real property rights. By the time we're done, she'll wish she'd never heard of Silver Creek Farm. Walking out of Jim's office, I felt something I hadn't felt since this whole mess started. Hope. We weren't just fighting back anymore, we were fighting smart. And with Jim Hunter in our corner, the Davidsons were about to learn that some farmers... Right back. After leaving Jim's office, I threw myself into the investigation phase of our battle plan. With Sarah coordinating research from college and Mike helping on the ground, we began gathering every piece of information we could find about the Davidsons' operation. Our dining room table transformed into a command center, covered with documents, laptops, and enough coffee cups to stock a small diner. Dad, you need to see this. Sarah's voice came through the laptop speaker as she shared her screen. She'd been digging through public records and business filings. The Davidson Development Group isn't just one company. It's a web of shell corporations. Look at these ownership records. The diagram she shared showed a complex network of companies, all ultimately leading back to the Davidson family. Environmental consulting firms, construction companies, property management groups, they'd created a closed system where every aspect of their development projects fed profits back to them. And here's where it gets interesting, she continued, highlighting several documents. Remember those farms they forced out in neighboring counties? Each one was purchased by a different shell company, but they all trace back to the same source. They're hiding their pattern of agricultural land acquisition. Mike walked in, carrying a stack of papers from the county recorder's office. It gets better, he said, spreading them out on the table. I found records of every road project they've done in the last 5 years. Every single one had environmental citations against the neighboring farms within months of construction starting. I started making connections, drawing lines between documents. So they use the road projects to create problems. Then their environmental consulting firm finds violations. And finally, their development company swoops in to save the struggling farmers by buying them out. Exactly, Sarah said, but they got sloppy with us. Usually they start with smaller access roads, gradually expanding them over time. This time, Karen went straight for a major grab, probably because of our new dairy facility. They didn't want us getting established with direct farm-to-market sales. Just then, Martha Peterson from the State Environmental Protection Office arrived with her team. She was a no-nonsense woman in practical field gear, carrying more scientific equipment than I'd seen since Sarah's last science fair project. "Show me everything," she said, pulling out a tablet. "Every drainage pattern, every water source, every bit of habitat they've disrupted." For the next 3 hours, we walked the property. Martha's team took soil samples, water readings, and hundreds of photographs. They mapped drainage patterns and documented wildlife habitats. With each new discovery, Martha's expression grew darker. "This is exactly what we've been looking for," she said, examining the destroyed culverts. "They've actually managed to create the very environmental problems they claim they're trying to prevent. See these erosion patterns? They're not from your farm operations. They're from their construction activity." Her team's drone mapped the entire area, creating a 3D model of the water flow patterns. "Your grandfather's drainage system was actually a textbook example of sustainable agricultural water management," she explained, showing me the data. "By destroying it, they've created a genuine environmental hazard." Inside, the information gathering continued. Mike had set up a digital database to organize everything we were finding. Property records, permit applications, environmental studies, news articles, anything that could help us understand and expose the Davidsons' operation. "Look at this pattern," I said, pointing to a timeline we'd created. Every farm they targeted had made significant improvements or investments within a year of the Davidsons showing up. They wait until farmers are financially committed, then strike. Sarah had found something else. "Dad, remember Karen's comment about emergency service access? I found their traffic study. It's completely fabricated. They used peak holiday traffic data from the highway to justify their claims about response times. The more we dug, the more we found." Karen's brother's environmental consulting firm had used the same boilerplate language in every report, just changing the farm names and dates. Their construction companies consistently filed permits using different names but the same equipment. And crews. "They're not just developing land," Martha said, reviewing our findings. "They're systematically eliminating family farms under the guise of community improvement. This is methodical, organized, and completely fraudulent." By evening, we had filled 3 whiteboards with connections and evidence. The Davidsons' entire operation was laid bare, a carefully constructed machine designed to consume family farms and spit out suburban developments. "The question is," Mike said, looking at our work, "how do we use all this?" I smiled, thinking of Jim Hunter's gleam when we'd shown him our initial evidence. "We don't just fight the road project," I said. "We expose their entire operation, every shell company, every fraudulent study, every manufactured crisis. They wanted to make an example of Silver Creek Farm? Well, we're going to make an example of them instead." Sarah's voice came through strong and clear. "They won't know what hit them until it's too late. By the time Karen realizes what we've uncovered, it'll be all over the State Environmental Protection Office's desk." Looking at the mountain of evidence we'd gathered, I felt a surge of satisfaction. The Davidsons had built their empire on paperwork and procedures, thinking no one would ever take the time to unravel it all. They'd never expected to go up against a farmer with a college-educated daughter, a dedicated farm manager, and a lifetime of keeping meticulous records. Their paper empire was about to meet a family that knew the value of doing things right, documenting everything and never ever giving up. With our evidence mounting, it was time to build our support network. While the Davidsons had their web of corporate connections, we had something potentially more powerful, a community that was tired of watching family farms disappear. I started with old Joe Henderson, whose farm bordered ours to the north. He'd been fighting his own battles with developers for years, and when I showed him what we'd uncovered about the Davidsons' operation, his weathered face broke into the first real smile I'd seen from him in months. "So, that's how they've been doing it," he said, examining our documentation. "I always wondered how they managed to get those environmental citations to appear right when they needed them. Count me in, Jack, whatever you need." Joe spread the word to other farmers in the county, and by noon, my kitchen was filled with people I'd known my whole life, all bringing their own stories and evidence of the Davidsons' tactics. They tried to claim my access road was a public safety hazard last spring, said Mary Wilson, whose organic vegetable farm had been in her family for 3 generations. Suddenly had all these complaints about my delivery trucks. Now I know why. Bill Thompson, who ran the local feed store, brought in records of farming supply deliveries going back 20 years. Proof that these farms have been actively operating, he explained. They can't claim these are abandoned properties when we've got documented business transactions. Sarah coordinated everything from college, creating a digital database of testimonies and evidence. "Dad, this is bigger than we thought," she said during our evening video call. "I've got farmers from 3 counties reaching out with similar stories. The Davidsons have been using the same playbook everywhere. Even local businesses started joining our cause. The owner of the dairy processing plant that bought most of our milk showed up with documentation of how the Davidsons rode. Projects had disrupted other farms' delivery routes. They're not just hurting farmers," he explained. "They're damaging the entire local food system. We've lost 3 supplier farms in the last 2 years because of their tactics." Martha, from the State Environmental Protection Office, had put us in touch with wildlife conservation groups who were furious about the destruction of natural habitats caused by the Davidsons' projects. They brought their own evidence, studies showing how the developers' actions had disrupted local ecosystems and wildlife corridors. Mike organized everything into clear, compelling presentations. "We're not just fighting for Silver Creek Farm anymore," he said, looking at the growing wall of evidence. "We're fighting for the whole farming community. The local historical society got involved after learning about the age of our road and its significance to the area's agricultural heritage. They brought in an architectural historian who documented the historical importance of our farm's infrastructure, including the drainage system the Davidsons had destroyed. This isn't just about property rights," the historian explained. "It's about preserving our agricultural heritage. These farms and their supporting infrastructure are living history." But our most unexpected ally came in the form of Rebecca Chen, a former employee of Davidson Development Group's Environmental Consulting Division. She'd quit 6 months ago after refusing to falsify environmental impact reports. "They have a template," she revealed, showing us internal documents she'd saved. "They just fill in the farm name and date, then add whatever environmental violations they need to justify their development plans. It's all fabricated." The support wasn't just moral, it was practical. Farmers offered alternative delivery routes through their properties for our dairy trucks. Local mechanics volunteered to help maintain our temporary access roads. The County Historical Society started the process of declaring our farm a historical agricultural site. Even some of the residents in the new developments started reaching out after learning how their homes had been acquired. Many hadn't known They were living on land that had been farmed for generations until the Davidsons forced the owners out. "We bought here because we wanted to live in an area with agricultural character," one resident told me. "We didn't know we were part of destroying that very thing." Sarah coordinated with local media contacts, carefully sharing our evidence and the growing community support. "We're not just exposing corruption," she explained. "We're showing how these developments are destroying the fabric of rural communities." By evening, our support network had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. The kitchen table was covered with business cards, contact information, and offers of help. The Davidsons might have had money and political connections, but we had something more valuable, a community united against their predatory practices. "You know what this means," Mike said, as we reviewed everything we'd gathered. "They're not just fighting us anymore. They're fighting an entire community that's tired of their tactics." Looking at the faces of my neighbors and friends, all committed to stopping the Davidsons' destruction of our agricultural heritage, I felt a surge of pride. Karen Davidson thought she was just taking on one stubborn farmer. Instead, she'd managed to unite an entire community against her operation. "Together," I told the gathered group, "we're going to show them that some things can't be bought, bullied, or bulldozed. Some things are worth fighting for." The battle for Silver Creek Farm had become something bigger, a stand against the systematic destruction of family farms and rural communities. And this time, we weren't standing alone. With our support network in place and evidence mounting, it was time to take direct action. The morning after our community meeting, I implemented what Sarah had dubbed Operation Farmland Defense. It wasn't just about stopping the Davidsons anymore. It was about making a statement that would be impossible to ignore. I started before dawn, positioning our farm equipment strategically around the damaged road. Our biggest tractor, old but reliable, took center position, decorated with a massive sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." Mike had added solar-powered spotlights to illuminate it at night, a beacon of resistance visible from the highway, but we didn't stop there. I'd learned from watching the Davidsons that appearances matter, so we set up a professional-looking information station right where they'd planned to start their boulevard. Large laminated maps showed the historical boundaries of our farm, complete with dated aerial photographs showing 60 years of continuous agricultural use. "They want to play the development game," I said to Mike as we finished setting up. "Let's show them how farmers do it." We'd installed high-definition security cameras covering every angle, their presence marked by clearly visible signs. "This area under 24/7 video surveillance." Let Karen try to claim we hadn't warned them. The local media showed up just as we were finishing. Sarah had timed it perfectly. Channel 5's agriculture reporter Amy Chen walked the property with me, documenting everything. She seemed particularly interested in the before and after photos showing the destruction of our historical drainage system. "So they just came in, without permission, and started destroying infrastructure that's been here for generations?" she asked, her cameraman capturing every detail. "That's right," I replied, pointing to the damaged culverts. 60 years of sustainable water management, destroyed in a day because someone decided their development was more important than our farm's survival. By mid-morning, Karen arrived with her usual entourage of suits and clipboards. The look on her face when she saw our setup was worth every minute of lost sleep. Her perfectly maintained composure cracked as she took in the media presence, the cameras, and our very visible display of property rights. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, marching up to our information station, her heels sinking into the soft earth. "Protecting private property," I replied calmly, aware of the news cameras rolling. "And documenting everything just like you taught us. We learned from the best after all." She glanced at the nearest security camera, then at the news crew. This is interfering with approved development plans. We have permits, fraudulent permits, I interrupted, loud enough for the cameras to catch. Based on falsified environmental studies and manufactured safety concerns. Would you like to discuss those on camera? That got her attention. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You're making a big mistake, Miller. We can make things very difficult for you. More difficult than destroying my road, than threatening my farm's operations, than trying to bully me into submission. I gestured to the information display. Everything's documented now, Karen. Every move you make, every threat, every attempt to destroy what my family has built. One of her suits whispered something in her ear, probably warning her about the cameras. She plastered on her corporate smile, but I could see the anger in her eyes. We're trying to improve the community, she said, raising her voice for the benefit of the news crew. This resistance to progress is only hurting your neighbors. That's when Bill Thompson, our feed store owner, stepped forward. We'd planned this part carefully. Progress, he called out. Is that what you call destroying family farms? Is that what you called it when you forced the Johnsons out of business? Or the Wilsons? Or the Hendersons? One by one, members of our community stepped forward, each sharing their story of the Davidsons' tactics. Karen's face grew increasingly pale as she realized this wasn't just about one stubborn farmer anymore. The construction crews she'd brought sat idle in their machines, clearly unsure whether to proceed. Our wall of tractors and farm equipment blocked their access, and with the media present, they couldn't just bulldoze their way through. "This isn't over," Karen snapped, turning on her heel. But as she walked away, I called after her. "You're right about that," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is just the beginning. We're not just protecting one farm anymore. We're exposing your entire operation. Every falsified study, every manufactured crisis, every family, farm you've destroyed. It's all coming out now." As she and her entourage retreated to their luxury vehicles, I turned to the news cameras. "This isn't about resisting progress," I said. "It's about protecting our agricultural heritage, our community, and our way of life. The Davidsons think they can bulldoze their way through anyone who stands in their way. Well, they picked the wrong farm this time." The message was clear. Silver. Greek Farm wasn't going down without a fight. And we weren't fighting alone anymore. Karen Davidson had started this thinking she was dealing with one stubborn farmer. Now she was facing an entire community ready to expose her operation for what it really was. As the news crews packed up and our supporters dispersed, Mike walked up beside me. "Think they got the message?" I watched Karen's car disappear down the road, leaving tracks in the mud. "Oh, they got it. The question is, what are they going to do about it?" "Something desperate," he replied. "You know they won't give up easily." "Count on it," I said, checking our security camera feeds. "But this time we'll be ready for whatever they throw at us." The battle lines were drawn, and there was no going back now. Karen Davidson had wanted a war. Well, now she had one. The Davidsons' retaliation came faster and harder than even I'd expected. The morning after our standoff, I woke up to find not one, but 3 different government inspection teams descending on our farm, each one armed with clipboards and an attitude that suggested they'd already decided we were in violation of something. OSHA requirements, EPA regulations, and Agricultural Department compliance. Mike listed off, watching from the front porch as the inspectors spread out across our property. They're hitting us with everything they've got. Karen herself didn't show up, but her influence was clear in every nitpicky observation and obscure regulation citation. The OSHA inspector spent 3 hours examining our new dairy facility, searching for violations in equipment we'd just had certified last month. The EPA team seemed particularly interested in our water runoff patterns, the same ones their construction had disrupted. Mr. Miller, the lead agricultural department inspector said, adjusting his glasses as he consulted his clipboard. Are you aware that your property has been flagged for multiple potential violations? Funny how those flags only appeared after we stopped the Davidsons' illegal road construction, I replied, keeping my voice level. Would you like to see our recent certification records, or perhaps the documentation of how their construction damaged our EPA-compliant drainage system? He blinked, clearly not expecting such a prepared response. Before he could reply, Sarah, he called. Dad, they're not just coming at us with inspections, she said urgently. They're trying to cancel our dairy contracts. 3 of our biggest buyers just got calls suggesting our milk might not meet safety standards. I felt my blood pressure rising but kept my cool. We'd anticipated this move. Send them the results from last week's independent quality testing, I told her, and get Jim Hunter on the phone. This is exactly the kind of business interference we've been documenting. But the Davidsons weren't done. By afternoon, a new threat emerged. A fleet of surveyors showed up, claiming they were reassessing property lines for the county. Their presence wasn't subtle. They made sure to plant their equipment right where our security cameras could catch them, making a show of taking measurements and consulting maps. They're trying to rattle us, Mike observed, watching them through binoculars. Make us think they've found some problem with our property boundaries. Let them try, I replied. We've got surveys going back to 1923, all properly filed and recorded. Plus, I nodded toward our own surveyor, quietly working on the other side of the property. We've got someone double-checking everything they do. The day took an even darker turn when local news stations began running stories about health and safety concerns at area farms. The reports never mentioned us by name, but the implications were clear. Karen was trying to turn public opinion against family farms. She's playing hardball, Jim Hunter said when he arrived late afternoon, but she made a mistake. All these inspections, the contract interference, the sudden survey, it establishes a pattern of harassment. We can add it to our case. Just then, a new group arrived. Men in expensive suits, carrying briefcases and wearing expressions that suggested they thought they owned the place. They marched straight up to my porch like they were entering a boardroom. Mr. Miller, the lead suit announced, we represent Davidson Development Group's legal team. We have some concerns about your recent actions and public statements. I didn't invite them in. All communication should go through my attorney. I replied, nodding toward Jim. So we're prepared to offer a generous settlement, another suit interjected. The Davidson Group is willing to purchase your property at well above market value, provided you sign an NDA and retract your accusations. Jim stepped forward, his farmer-turned-lawyer presence somehow making their expensive suits look shabby. Gentlemen, are you attempting to buy my client's silence regarding potentially fraudulent business practices? Please speak clearly for the security cameras. They shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the cameras recording their every move. The lead suit cleared his throat. We're merely trying to reach an amicable solution by sending multiple inspection teams to harass us, by interfering with our business contracts, by spreading false information about our operations. I counted off each point on my fingers. Seems like an interesting definition of amicable to me. Mr. Miller, you're making this more difficult than necessary, the third suit said, his tone condescending. Ms. Davidson is prepared to be generous, but her patience isn't unlimited. Neither is mine, I replied. You can tell Karen that Silver Greek Farm isn't for sale, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And if she wants to keep pushing, we've got plenty more evidence to share with the authorities. They left, looking considerably less confident than they'd arrived, but I knew this wasn't the end. Karen Davidson wasn't used to losing, and she'd just deployed some of her biggest weapons without success. They'll try something else, Jim warned, as we watched the suits retreat to their luxury cars. This was just the first wave. Let them come, I said, reviewing the security footage of the day's events. Every move they make just gives us more evidence. They think they're showing their power, but they're really just showing their desperation. Mike nodded toward the setting sun, where the last of the inspectors were finally leaving. Think they found anything they can use against us? Doesn't matter if they did, I replied. We've got documentation of every inspection, every conversation, every attempt to interfere with our business. Karen wanted to play hardball. Well, she's about to learn that farmers know how to dig in for a long fight. The question wasn't if they'd strike again, but when and how. But this time, we'd be ready. Every move they made just added to our case against them. And sooner or later, they'd make a mistake we could use to bring their whole operation down. The story broke wider than any of us expected. What started as local news coverage of a farmer standing up to developers suddenly exploded into a national conversation about the systematic destruction of America's family farms. Sarah's social media campaign had caught fire, with our security camera footage of Karen's bullying tactics going viral overnight. "Dad, you need to see this," Sarah called early that morning. "Major networks are picking up the story. They're calling it the Battle for Silver Creek Farm." People are sharing their own stories of developer harassment from all over the country. I was watching the morning news when the first national crew arrived. They weren't alone. By mid-morning, her farm had become ground zero for a much bigger story than just our fight against the Davidsons. Mr. Miller, a reporter from a major network, asked, standing in front of our blocked road, "Can you tell us about the pattern of behavior you've uncovered regarding the Davidson Development Group?" Before I could answer, another crew pushed forward. "Is it true that they've used similar tactics to force out other family farms in the region?" The media circus was in full swing, but we were ready. Sarah had prepared a detailed press packet, documenting everything: the falsified environmental studies, the pattern of harassment, the systematic destruction of agricultural communities. Each reporter got copies of our evidence, along with contact information for other farmers who'd faced similar tactics. Karen's response came via a hastily called press conference at her downtown office. The contrast couldn't have been more striking. Her in her designer suit against a backdrop of corporate logos, while I stood on my farm in work boots, surrounded by actual working agricultural land. "Davidson Development Group has always operated within the law," she declared, her practiced smile looking strained under the harsh camera lights. "These accusations are nothing more than the desperate attempts of one farmer resistant to necessary progress." But her usual tactics weren't working this time. Reporters began asking pointed questions about the environmental studies her brother's company had produced. Someone had leaked internal emails showing how they recycled the same violations for different farms. "Ms. Davidson, can you explain why identical environmental violations appear in reports for different properties, right down to the GPS coordinates?" The cameras caught her mask slipping for just a moment. "We'll have our legal team review those documents." Back at Silver Creek Farm, we were telling a different story. Local farmers showed up to support us, each with their own tales of Davidson Development Group's tactics. The media ate it up. Fourth-generation farmers describing how their lands had been systematically targeted, their roads blocked, their operations strangled by mysterious regulations until they had no choice but to sell. "Look at this pattern," I explained to a group of reporters, pointing to our wall of evidence. Every farm they targeted had recently invested in improvements. They wait until farmers are financially committed, then strike. It's not random. It's predatory. Martha from the State Environmental Protection Office chose that moment to hold her own press conference. Standing in front of our destroyed drainage system, she laid out the technical evidence of how the Davidsons' construction had actually created the very environmental problems they claimed to be fixing. "This is a 60-year-old sustainable water," Management system, she explained, pointing to our documentation. Its destruction has caused more environmental damage in 1 week than this farm has in 3 generations of operation. The story kept growing. Other communities that had dealt with the Davidsons started reaching out. A pattern emerged of small towns transformed by aggressive development, their agricultural heritage erased under waves of cookie-cutter housing developments. Sarah coordinated everything from college, managing social media, and connecting reporters with sources. Dad, people are organizing protests outside Davidson development offices in 3 states, she reported. This is becoming a movement. Even some residents of Davidson developments joined in, sharing stories of how they'd been sold dreams of rural charm, while unknowingly participating in the destruction of actual rural communities. We bought here because we wanted to be part of farm country, one resident told reporters, standing in front of her Valley Vista home. We had no idea we were contributing to its destruction. The media attention forced politicians to take notice. Local officials, many with long-standing ties to the Davidsons, suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Questions arose about permit, approvals, zoning changes, and suspicious patterns of campaign contributions. By evening, the story had evolved from a simple property dispute into an exposé of systematic rural development fraud. National news programs ran special segments on the disappearance of family farms, using our fight as a central example of resistance. This isn't just about one road or one farm anymore, I told the cameras. This is about protecting America's agricultural heritage from predatory development. Every family farm lost is another piece of our food independence destroyed. The coverage was having an effect. Karen's usual tactics of legal threats and regulatory pressure looked different under the glare of national media attention. Her carefully crafted image as a progressive developer bringing improvement to rural areas was crumbling as evidence of her methods came to light. They thought they could bury us in paperwork and pressure, I said to Mike as we watched the evening news coverage. Instead, they've managed to spark a national conversation about the future of family farming. Think it'll make a difference? He asked, watching another news van pull up. It already has, I replied. Karen Davidson wanted to make an example of Silver Creek Farm. Well, she got her wish, just not the way she planned. The battle for our farm had become something bigger, a symbol of resistance against the corporate destruction of rural America. And this time, the whole country was watching. The morning of the county zoning board hearing arrived with a tension you could cut with a knife. We'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing it could make or break not just our fight, but set a precedent for family farms everywhere. I stood in my kitchen at dawn, adjusting my tie in the reflection of the window. Not my usual farming attire, but today wasn't a usual day. Sarah had flown in from college specifically for this, and she was already reviewing our presentation materials one last time. Everything's organized chronologically, she explained, laying out folders on the kitchen table. Environmental evidence, property records, documentation of harassment, witness statements, all indexed and cross-referenced. Mike arrived early, carrying a stack of enlarged photographs showing the progression of damage to our property. Latest drone footage from yesterday, he said, adding them to our materials. Shows they tried to start construction again last night, even with the stop work order in place. Jim Hunter, our lawyer, had insisted we arrive early to set up our presentation properly. Perception matters, he told us. We're not just fighting their arguments, we're fighting their image. They'll show up looking like corporate success. We need to look like professional farmers protecting their heritage. The local news crews were already gathering outside the county building when we arrived. Karen and her team had clearly planned their entrance. They arrived in a convoy of luxury cars, each member of her team carrying matching leather briefcases. "Ready for this?" Jim asked as we watched them file in. "Born ready," I replied, straightening my tie one last time. Inside the hearing room, we set up our evidence methodically. Sarah had created professional displays showing the history of Silver Creek Farm, including aerial photographs documenting 60 years of agricultural use. Mike positioned the security camera footage to play at key moments. Karen's team took their seats across the aisle, spreading out expensive-looking presentations about property values and community development. I noticed they'd brought in consultants from out of state, experts paid to testify about the benefits of their development plans. They're going to try to overwhelm us with technical jargon and economic projections, Jim warned quietly. But we've got something better: truth and documented evidence. The room filled quickly. Other farmers from the area came to show support, along with environmental activists, historical preservation groups, and even residents from existing Davidson developments who'd turned against the company after learning of their tactics. Martha from the State Environmental Protection Office arrived with her team, carrying their own evidence about the ecological impact of the Davidsons' construction practices. She gave us a confident nod as she took her seat. Just before the hearing began, Rebecca Chen, the former Davidson employee who'd blown the whistle on their environmental report fraud, slipped into the room. Her presence clearly rattled Karen's team. I saw them hurriedly conferring, probably adjusting their strategy. "All rise," the clerk announced as the zoning board members filed in. 5 people who would decide not just the fate of our road, but potentially the future of family farming in our region. Sarah squeezed my hand under the table. "We've got this, Dad," she whispered. "They might have money and connections, but we've got something they can't buy: generations of truth." Jim stood to make our opening statement, his farmer-turned-lawyer presence commanding attention. Behind him, our first display showed the original survey of Silver Creek Farm from 1923. My great-grandfather's signature clearly visible at the bottom. Karen's lead attorney stood next, talking about progress and community development, property values and tax revenues. But I noticed he carefully avoided mentioning the environmental studies or their pattern of targeting family farms. As I waited for our turn to present evidence, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The generations of farmers who'd worked our land, the community that had rallied to support us, the truth we'd uncovered about the Davidsons' operations. This isn't just a zoning hearing, I reminded myself. This is our stand against the systematic destruction of America's agricultural heritage. The evidence was prepared, our witnesses were ready, and the truth was on our side. Karen Davidson might have money and political connections, but we had something more powerful, a community united against her predatory practices and a story that needed to be told. The showdown was about to begin, and this time we weren't just fighting for Silver Creek Farm. We were fighting for every family farm threatened by corporate greed, disguised as progress. The board will now hear evidence in the matter of Davidson Development Group versus Silver Creek Farm, the chairman announced. Game time. The hearing room fell silent as Jim Hunter rose to present our case. The overhead projector hummed to life, displaying our first piece of evidence, a timeline of the Davidson Development Group's systematic targeting of family farms. "Members of the board," Jim began, his voice steady and clear, "what you're about to see isn't just about one road or one farm. This is about a calculated pattern of predatory development that threatens the very existence of our agricultural heritage." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Jim methodically laid out our evidence. First came the property records, showing the continuous agricultural use of our road for 60 years. Then the documentation of their unauthorized construction, complete with time-stamped security footage of their bulldozers destroying our drainage system. But the real story, Jim continued, begins with this. He switched to the internal documents Rebecca Chen had provided, showing how the Davidsons recycled environmental violations across different properties. Notice the identical GPS coordinates in reports supposedly conducted at different farms. Karen's lawyers jumped up to object, but Martha from the Environmental Protection Office was ready. She stepped forward with her own documentation, confirming the fraudulent nature of the environmental studies. These reports weren't just inaccurate, Martha testified, pointing to her detailed analysis. They were deliberately falsified to create artificial crises that the Davidson Group could then use to force farms into selling. The board members leaned forward, examining the evidence with increasing concern. One of them, an elderly woman who'd been silent until now, removed her glasses and stared directly at Karen. "Miss Davidson," she said, her voice sharp, "would you care to explain why your brother's environmental consulting firm used identical violation reports for properties 50 miles apart?" Karen's composure cracked slightly. She turned to whisper urgently to her lawyers, but the damage was done. The pattern was becoming clear to everyone in the room. Then came our succession of witnesses. First, the Johnsons from the neighboring county, describing how the Davidsons had used road access issues to force them out of business. Then other farmers, each with similar stories of mysterious environmental citations appearing just when the Davidson Group showed interest in their land. "The method is always the same," I testified, standing before the board. "They identify farms that have made recent investments, create artificial crises through manipulated studies and access issues, then swoop in to save the farmers by buying them out at desperate prices." Karen's team tried to counter with presentations about property values and tax revenues, but their arguments felt hollow against our mountain of evidence. Their paid experts spoke about theoretical benefits while we showed real damage to farms, to families, to entire communities. The turning point came when Rebecca Chen took the stand. As a former insider, her testimony was devastating. She described in detail how the Davidson Group manufactured environmental crises, manipulated inspection reports, and coordinated with various shell companies to hide their pattern of agricultural land acquisition. "We had templates," she explained, displaying internal documents. "We didn't even bother changing all the details, just the farm names and dates. The violations were pre-written before we ever visited the properties." Karen's face had gone from confident to concerned to nearly panic-stricken as Rebecca continued her testimony. When one of her lawyers passed her a note, she read it and immediately stood up. "We request a recess," she announced, her voice lacking its usual authority. "Denied," the board chairman replied firmly. "Please continue, Ms. Chen." For the next hour, Rebecca laid bare the entire operation, the fake studies, the coordinated harassment, the systematic destruction of family farms across 3 states. With each revelation, Karen's carefully constructed facade crumbled further. When it was Karen's turn to testify, her usual smooth confidence was gone. Under questioning from the board, she stumbled through explanations about the identical environmental reports, contradicted her own previous statements about road access requirements, and finally resorted to vague claims about progress and inevitable development. "Ms. Davidson," the elderly board member interrupted, "we're not here to discuss your vision of progress. We're here to address evidence of systematic fraud and harassment of agricultural properties. Would you like to address these specific allegations?" Karen looked around the room, perhaps finally realizing how completely her tactics had been exposed. The carefully maintained image of a visionary developer bringing improvement to rural areas had been stripped away, revealing the truth beneath. "We operated within the law," she managed, but her voice lacked conviction. "Within the law?" Jim stood up. "Let's review exactly what laws were followed when you sent bulldozers onto private property without permission, destroyed EPA-compliant drainage systems, and used fraudulent environmental reports to justify your actions." The rest of the hearing unfolded like a slow-motion demolition of everything the Davidson Development Group had built. Each piece of evidence, each witness testimony, each revealed document added to the growing picture of corporate corruption. Masked as community development, by the time the last witness stepped down, even Karen's most expensive lawyers looked defeated. The truth had come out, and no amount of legal maneuvering could put it back in the box. The battle for Silver Creek Farm had become something much bigger, an exposé of corporate greed and the systematic destruction of American agricultural heritage. And as the board prepared to make their decision, I realized we'd already won something more important than just a zoning dispute. We'd exposed the truth, and that was something no amount of money or political connections could erase. The board's deliberation lasted only 45 minutes, remarkably short for a case of this magnitude. When they filed back into the hearing room, the tension was palpable. Karen sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles white as she gripped her designer handbag. I felt Sarah's hand slip into mine under the table. The chairman cleared his throat and adjusted his microphone. In the matter of Davidson Development Group versus Silver Creek Farm, this board has reached a unanimous decision. He paused, looking directly at Karen before continuing. The purported annexation of Silver Creek Farm's private road is hereby declared null and void. All construction activities must cease immediately, and the property must be restored to its original condition at Davidson Development Group's expense. A murmur ran through the room. But the chairman wasn't finished. Furthermore, given the evidence presented of systematic fraud and harassment, this board is referring all documentation to the State Attorney General's Office for Criminal Investigation. The pattern of falsified environmental reports, fraudulent permit applications, and coordinated harassment of agricultural properties warrants immediate legal scrutiny. Karen's face went from pale to ashen. One of her lawyers immediately started scribbling notes, while another whispered urgently in her ear. But the board wasn't done delivering their verdict. Additionally, the elderly board member added, adjusting her glasses, we are recommending a full audit of all Davidson Development Group projects within the county. Every permit, every environmental study, every property acquisition from the past 5 years will be reviewed. The chairman raised his hand for silence as excited whispers filled the room. Given the severity of these findings, we are also issuing an immediate suspension of all Davidson Development Group projects pending the completion of these investigations. Karen stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This is absurd. You can't just halt all our projects based on one farmer's complaints. Ms. Davidson, the chairman replied firmly, we're not acting on complaints. We're acting on documented evidence of fraud, witness testimony, and your own company's internal records. Would you like to explain why identical environmental violations appear in reports for properties 50 miles apart? She had no answer for that. None of her expensive lawyers did either. Furthermore, he continued, we're issuing an immediate order for Davidson Development Group to restore all damaged infrastructure at Silver Creek Farm. This includes, but is not limited to, the drainage system, fencing, and road surface. All costs will be borne by your company. The victory was comprehensive, but what happened next surprised everyone. Martha from the Environmental Protection Office stepped forward with 2 state troopers. Karen Davidson, Martha announced, her voice carrying across the now silent room. Based on the evidence presented today and our ongoing investigation, I have been authorized to serve you with these warrants. The State Environmental Protection Office is seizing all records from Davidson Environmental Consulting and related companies, pending a criminal investigation into fraudulent environmental reporting. The look on Karen's face as she watched her carefully constructed empire begin to crumble was something I'll never forget. All the arrogance, all the smugness, all the certainty that money and connections could buy anything, it all vanished in that moment. Her legal team huddled around her, but there was little they could do. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious, the fraud too blatant. As the state troopers began securing documents and computers, Karen finally turned to look at me. "You don't understand what you've done," she said, her voice barely controlled. "The jobs, the development, the progress, you've ruined everything." I stood up slowly, straightening my tie. "No, Karen, you ruined everything when you decided that your vision of progress was worth destroying generations of agricultural heritage. This isn't about stopping development, it's about stopping corruption." Sarah stepped forward then, tablet in hand. "And by the way, Ms. Davidson, everything that just happened, it's already trending on social media. Does Farmers vs. Corruption is the top hashtag in 3 states. The media crews outside the hearing room were waiting like hungry wolves. As Karen tried to leave, they surrounded her with questions about fraudulent environmental reports, predatory development practices, and systematic harassment of family farms. Her security team had to practically carry her to her car through the crowd of reporters. Back inside, Jim was gathering our materials while receiving congratulations from other lawyers. "This isn't just a victory for Silver Creek Farm," he said, beaming. "This is a precedent that will help protect family farms across the state." Martha caught my eye and nodded toward the door. Outside, away from the media circus, she spoke quietly. "This is just the beginning, Jack. The evidence you helped uncover. We're finding similar patterns in other states. The Davidson Group isn't the only developer using these tactics." "So this could go national?" Sarah asked, her eyes bright with possibility. "It already has," Martha replied. "My phone's been ringing, non-stop with calls from other state agencies. Everyone wants to know how we caught them." Looking back at the hearing room, at the state troopers boxing up evidence, at Karen's defeated legal team packing up their expensive briefcases, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about saving our farm anymore. It was about exposing a system of corruption that had been destroying family farms for years. The battle for Silver Creek Farm was over, but something bigger had just begun. In the weeks following, the hearing, the transformation at Silver Creek Farm was remarkable. The Davidson Development Group, under court order and strict supervision, began the process of restoring everything they'd destroyed. Their once aggressive construction crews now worked carefully, following our specifications to rebuild what they'd torn apart. "Make sure they're using the original grade for the drainage system," I instructed Mike as we watched them work. "My grandfather designed those angles for a reason." The workers, many of them the same ones who destroyed our road under Karen's orders, now seemed almost apologetic as they meticulously reconstructed our infrastructure. The restoration went beyond just fixing the road. Every aspect of damage had to be addressed, from replanting trees to rebuilding fencing. Environmental experts supervised each step, ensuring everything was returned to its proper state. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same company that had falsified environmental reports was now being forced to follow actual environmental standards. Sarah coordinated the documentation of the restoration process, creating a detailed record that would serve as a template for other farms facing similar situations. "Every step is being recorded," she explained, managing the drone footage. "Other farmers need to see that it's possible to fight back and win." The changes weren't just physical. The exposure of the Davidson Group's tactics had triggered a wave of reforms in local government. The County Planning Commission underwent a complete overhaul, with new guidelines put in place to protect agricultural land. Karen's brother and cousin resigned from their positions on various boards, and investigations into their past decisions were ongoing. "You've started something bigger than you realize," Jim told me one morning as we reviewed the latest round of legal documents. "Other counties are adopting similar protections. They're calling it the Silver Creek Standards, minimum requirements for protecting agricultural land from predatory development." The media attention had died down, but the impact continued to spread. Farmers from other states reached out, sharing their own stories and asking for advice. Sarah created a website to share our documentation and strategies, helping other farming communities protect themselves from similar tactics. Martha's investigation had expanded far beyond our county. The evidence we'd uncovered had opened doors to examining similar patterns across multiple states. The Davidson Group was just the tip of the iceberg, she explained during one of her frequent visits. We're finding similar operations everywhere, all using the same playbook. Even some of the residents in existing Davidson developments joined the reform movement. They formed committees to protect remaining agricultural land, recognizing that the rural character they'd been promised depended on actually preserving working farms. We bought into their vision of progress, one resident told me, but now we understand that real progress means balancing development with preservation. The dairy facility that Karen had tried to cut off was now operating at full capacity. Our direct farm-to-market operation was thriving, with customers more committed than ever to supporting local agriculture. The restored road, built back to my grandfather's specifications, handled the traffic perfectly. Mike oversaw the installation of new security systems, ensuring we'd never be caught off guard again. "Best investment we ever made," he said, showing me the coverage maps. "Nobody's going to sneak in with bulldozers ever again." Local officials, many of whom had once been firmly in the Davidsons' pocket, now approached agricultural issues with new caution. The days of rubber-stamping development plans without proper scrutiny were over. Every proposal had to include detailed impact studies on existing farm operations, real ones this time, not the copy-and-paste versions Karen's brother had specialized. The restoration work continued through the harvest season, a daily reminder of both what we'd almost lost and what we'd managed to save. Each repaired culvert, each rebuilt fence section, each restored drainage channel represented a victory not just for our farm, but for the principle that some things are worth more than development profits. Sarah's documentation of the restoration process became part of a larger educational initiative. Agricultural schools started using our case as a study in both modern farming challenges and the importance of maintaining detailed records. "Your grandfather's meticulous record-keeping saved the farm," she reminded me. "Future farmers need to understand why that matters." The changes weren't limited to our immediate area. Other communities began examining their own development patterns, looking for signs of the tactics we'd exposed. The Davidson Group's method of targeting farms that had made recent investments became a recognized red flag, helping other farmers spot potential threats before they developed. As I watched the last section of our road being restored, I thought about how close we'd come to losing everything. The bulldozers that had once threatened our farm were now rebuilding what they'd destroyed, under the watchful eyes of environmental inspectors and our own security cameras. "It's not just about fixing the damage," I explained to a group of visiting farmers. "It's about making sure it never happens again, not here, not anywhere." The battle for Silver Creek Farm had evolved into something none of us had expected. A blueprint for protecting agricultural heritage in the face of aggressive development. What Karen had intended as a show of force had instead become a demonstration of how family farms could fight back and win. Every restored inch of our road stood as testimony to a simple truth. Some things can't be bulldozed, some heritage can't be bought, and some fights are worth every ounce of effort they demand. A year after the Davidson Group's bulldozers first rolled onto our property, I stood at the same spot where I'd first discovered their destruction, sipping my morning coffee. But this time, the view was completely different. Our restored road stretched before me, its carefully maintained surface a testament to both what we'd almost lost and what we'd managed to save. The morning sun cast long shadows across the repaired drainage system, now functioning exactly as my grandfather had designed it 60 years ago. The new security cameras caught the first rays of light, their presence a quiet reminder of lessons learned and battles won. Karen Davidson had disappeared from public view shortly after the hearing, but her legacy lived on in an unexpected way. The exposure of her company's tactics had sparked a national conversation about the preservation of agricultural land. The Davidson case, as it became known in legal circles, was now required reading in environmental law courses. Sarah had graduated and returned to the farm full-time, bringing with her new ideas about combining traditional farming practices with modern technology. The website she'd created to document our fight had evolved into a nationwide resource for farming communities facing development pressure. "You know what's ironic, Dad?" she said, joining me with her own coffee cup. Karen wanted to be remembered for transforming rural America. Well, she succeeded, just not the way she planned. She was right. The transformation that followed our victory wasn't about replacing farms with subdivisions. Instead, it was about strengthening the protections for agricultural land and exposing the tactics used to undermine family farming. Mike approached, carrying the morning's dairy production reports. Our new facility was operating at full capacity, proving that traditional farming could adapt and thrive without sacrificing its heritage. The restored road handled our delivery trucks perfectly, just as it had for generations. "Got some visitors coming today," he mentioned. "Another group of farmers from out west. They're fighting something similar to what we faced." These visits had become regular occurrences. Silver Creek Farm had transformed into something of a pilgrimage site for farming communities facing development pressure. They came to see our security systems, examine our documentation methods, and learn from our experience. "You know what the real victory was?" I said, looking out over our fields where the morning mist was just beginning to lift. "It wasn't just saving our farm. It was showing others how to save theirs." The ripple effects of our stand against the Davidson Group had spread far beyond our county lines. State legislatures were passing new protections for agricultural land. Environmental agencies had developed better methods for detecting fraudulent impact studies. Development proposals now faced real scrutiny when they impacted farming operations. But perhaps the most significant change was in the farming community itself. The isolation that had made farms vulnerable to developers like Karen was being replaced by networks of mutual support and shared knowledge. Sarah's website had become a hub for sharing tactics, documenting threats, and coordinating responses. "Remember what Karen said about progress being inevitable?" Sarah asked, watching a flock of birds settle on our restored fence line. She was right about that part. She just didn't understand what real progress looks like. Real progress, we'd learned, wasn't about paving over heritage. It was about finding ways to preserve what matters while adapting to changing times. Our farm stood as proof that agricultural tradition and modern innovation could coexist and thrive. The security cameras caught movement at the farm's entrance, the first of today's visitors arriving. Another group of farmers coming to learn how to protect their land, their heritage, their way of life. "You know what your great-grandfather would say about all this?" I asked Sarah as we prepared to greet our guests. "What's that?" "He'd say sometimes you have to fight for what matters, but more importantly, you have to show others how to fight too." Looking out over Silver Creek Farm, at the restored road, the thriving dairy facility, the preserved drainage systems, and all the security measures that now protected it, I felt a deep satisfaction. Karen Davidson had wanted to make an example of our farm. She'd succeeded, but not in the way she'd intended. Instead of demonstrating the inevitability of development, she'd helped create a blueprint for resistance. Every farmer who visited, every community that adopted our methods, every piece of legislation inspired by our fight, all of it grew from her attempt to bulldoze one private road. Ready to meet our visitors? Sarah asked, already heading toward the entrance. I took one last look at our restored road, remembering the morning I'd first seen those bulldozers. You know what, Sarah? I think I've been ready my whole life, because in the end, this wasn't just about saving one farm or stopping one developer. It was about standing up for something bigger than ourselves. It was about proving that some things, heritage, community, the right to protect what matters, are worth fighting for. And that's a lesson worth passing on, one farmer at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.